Chapter 20 Motara 28 days before the Toa's descent. Takua followed Turaga no Kama's advice. He had spent 3 days in Ga-Koro, living among its residents and embracing their culture. He quickly learned the Ga-Matoran were so much more patient, thoughtful, and empathetic than his old Ta-Matoran neighbors. Their lives were much more peaceful. While the Ta-Matoran put so much focus toward fighting and defense, the Ga-Matoran valued education and natural beauty. He had the opportunity to see Ga-Matoran life up close, even taking part in the activities that didn't require as much physical exertion. He was taken fishing for the first time in his life, where he learned all the nuances behind various baiting techniques and lures, as well as the proper protocols for avoiding Tarakava. He also paid a visit to Shasa to see the fiku farm Macku had mentioned. While he was there, he was able to see how she made sailcloth from their webs. Upon hearing of his injuries, he was frequently treated to the hospitality of multiple Ga-Matoran, often in the form of fresh seafood. He had managed to eat enough riki cakes to make himself sick, only to eat even more the following day. These traits did not make them superior to the Ta-Matoran, however, even in Takua's eyes. He found many things among their culture to be lacking in comparison. For one, their defense force was quite shoddy when compared to the legendary Po-Koro Guard. The Ga-Koro Guard was the most modest of all defense forces throughout the island, with little more than 80 total guards among more than 2,200 villagers. The Po-Koro Guard had established an outpost along the beach of Gawahi, just as they did in every region, which was led by Sergeant Nuri and his platoon, though they rarely entered the village. This didn't make Takua feel much safer. The outpost was nearly 3 miles from the village, and Sergeant Nuri had a reputation for being hot-headed, even by Ta-Matoran standards. The fact that the damage from the Tarakava attack that occurred just 1 day prior to his arrival was still clearly visible throughout the East District didn't help his sense of security either. Ta-Matoran were much more dutiful, and while he felt they often took things too seriously, he felt the Ga-Matoran didn't take things seriously enough. He needed a balance, and he hoped Po-Koro would be that balance. Macku was delighted to hear that Turaga no Kama agreed to allow her to guide Takua through Po-Wahi. The Turaga was hesitant to agree to the decision, but couldn't argue that Macku was the best fit for the job. At first, Turaga no Kama suggested that she herself would be Takua's guide, but she felt she couldn't leave the newly appointed right hand in charge of the village with such short notice. Still, the Turaga requested an escort to transport them across the bay until they reached the shores of Po-Wahi, if for no other reason than to remind Macku she was still in trouble. The one assigned to the task was Kai, who Takua quickly realized to be the least personable and most intimidating Ga-Matoran he had ever met. Kai wore a great kikama, which was partially obscured by the brown tricorn hat that sported a single bright red feather on the top. The focal point of her rugged appearance was the metal hook fastened to her wrist in place of her right hand. She hardly said a word throughout the trip, only responding to the other 2 Matoran in short, single-word answers while constantly glancing out toward the horizon, and occasionally glaring at her passengers for making too much noise. This raised several questions for Takua, but he decided to wait until they arrived on the shore before asking Macku anything. They traveled along in a fishing boat much larger than the one Takua had sailed in the previous days. The trip across the bay had taken less than half an hour, but felt much longer due to the awkward tension created by the silence. They soon arrived along a lone dock reaching out from the Po-Wahi shore. The dock was accompanied by a small, uninhabited shack. Beyond that was nothing but sand dunes spanning for miles. Macku grabbed her bag and hopped onto the dock, immediately turning back to assist Takua. Although his injuries had shown significant improvement during his stay in Ga-Koro, he still had a long way to go before he was fully healed. Takua gave a polite wave as they moved up the dock. Kai sailed back toward Ga-Koro as Takua and Macku began their journey. Once she was a safe distance away, Takua wasted no time turning toward Macku.
So what's her story?
He asked.
Kai is one of the most famous sailors in Ga-Koro,
Macku explained. She had a feeling he was eager to ask that question when she noticed him staring at her. It wasn't a terrible question either. Kai was definitely an outlier among Ga-Matoran, especially to outsiders.
She's traveled farther beyond the waters of Matanui than any Matoran in history.
So, what happened to her hand?
Back when Ga-Koro was still being constructed, we were attacked by Tarakava.
I guess some things never change,
Takua commented.
This wasn't just any Tarakava.
Macku continued.
It was the Tarakava Nui, the biggest one anyone has ever seen. Many of us believe it was the first one to be infected. After the attack, Kai took it upon herself to track down and kill it.
How?
Takua asked as he became noticeably invested in Macku's tale.
She set off with a small crew to track it down. They sailed for 4 days before finally finding it. I guess it didn't go as planned. We found her several days later when she washed back up on the shore, clinging to a floating plank that once belonged to her boat. The rest of the crew was never found.
An experience like that would certainly change a Matoran,
Takua said.
She's lucky to be alive.
I'll say.
Macku replied.
She hasn't been the same since, and that thing is still out there. Every few years it gets spotted lurking a few miles out from the village. And she's never stopped preparing for the day when it finally returns for round 2.
She's going to get herself killed.
You're not the first one to think that.
Macku said.
I just hope the Toa can fix this before it comes to that. Too many Matoran have already died in this war.
Takua nodded. As the pair continued traveling along the sand-covered path, the air became increasingly dry. Most Ga-Matoran would have found the parching wind unbearable, but Macku had grown accustomed to the feeling over the years through countless unauthorized trips through the Wahi. Hailing from Po-Koro, Takua was no stranger to heat either. The Motara Desert stretched more than 8 miles across the northeastern portion of the island, most of which was nothing but desolate fields of sand and rock. Although despite the purported scarcity of resources, the region was teeming with life.
Look!
Macku called abruptly, pointing eastward. Takua turned to see what got her so excited. What he saw was a massive herd of at least 40 large gray rahi scavenging for food in the distance.
What are those?
Takua asked. The congregating beasts were immensely muscular and sturdy, brandishing their sword-like nasal horns as they sniffed along the sandy ground, sweeping their long, lizard-like tails behind them.
Kikanalo!
Macku replied with excitement.
There's so many of them!
I've never seen one in person before.
I've never seen them this far west before.
Macku replied.
They usually stay closer to Pook's Vantage.
As all Matoran, Takua had heard much about the famous Kikanalo herds of Po-Wahi, though he never expected to see them up close. The highly intelligent and enigmatic creatures were widely respected throughout all Matoran cultures. And though they were far from harmless, their minds were free, remaining as one of the few formidable Rahi species to successfully evade Makuta's grasp. The largest of the herd perked its head up, peering out toward the 2 Matoran while the rest continued to sniff the ground.
Does it see us?
Takua asked nervously.
Most likely.
Macku replied casually.
We don't exactly blend into our surroundings.
What do we do?
Nothing. Kikanalo never attack unprovoked.
Right.
Takua said.
And how do we make sure we don't provoke them?
Relax, Takua. It's just checking us out. It's not used to seeing non-Po Matoran.
The herd was still a fair distance away, but despite their size, Kikanalo were incredibly fast. If they chose to attack, there would be nothing Takua or Macku could do before either getting skewered or trampled into bent metal and jelly. Fortunately, the head Kikanalo finished his assessment, concluding they were not a threat. Takua sighed in relief as it dropped its head back down toward the ground.
Come on.
Macku said as she turned back toward the path.
We still have a while before we get to Po-Koro.
Takua took one final look at the herd before joining Macku. Within minutes, the Kikanalo herd was out of sight, The expanse of sand dunes and dusty pathways was all that remained for a long while. To the west of their trail was the famous Tiro Canyon, which gave Takua flashbacks of his night in the Toa canister. The empty green eyes of the Nui Jaga left a permanent mark within his memories. He only wished his memories included why he fell from the bluff back in Tawahi. Everything between his exile and waking up on the beach was missing.
How much further?
Takua asked.
It's another 2 hours from here.
Macku replied.
We could cut through the canyon, but I'd rather not get eaten by a Nui Jaga.
2 hours is fine with me,
said Takua.
I'm just excited to see Po-Koro.
There's a lot to see there.
Macku said.
You're going to love it. They have some of the most talented artists on the island. You could spend days just looking at all of their sculptures and carvings.
What's Huki like?
Huki?
Macku asked defensively.
What about Huki?
Turaga no Kama said he's the reason you're always sneaking off to Po-Koro.
He's a friend.
He has quite the reputation around Takoro. I've even heard some compare him to Jala.
Macku smiled.
He's the greatest Matoran I've ever met. He deserves all the praise he gets.
I look forward to meeting him.
Maybe we can catch a Kolhi game while we're there.
Macku said excitedly.
It's always fun to see him play. No one has ever beaten him before.
Though Takua wasn't sure why, hearing Macku gush about Huki made him feel slightly tense. He felt a tinge of jealousy. He couldn't explain it, since he had spent his entire life surrounded by Matoran far greater and more accomplished than himself. He was used to it, but this was somehow different. He didn't feel jealous of Huki for being such an impressive Matoran. He was fairly certain he was jealous because Macku thought he was such an impressive Matoran. It was an odd feeling, and it was quickly dismissed when his confusion about the feeling became stronger than the feeling itself. Perhaps he was overthinking. But overthinking what? He wasn't sure, and he was ready to change the subject.
I've heard a few Pomatoran merchants talk about Koli over the years,
Takua said.
but I still don't know what it is.
It's really hard,
Macku explained.
but a lot of fun. Turaga Onewa and Wenawa came up with it several decades ago to settle a trading dispute between the two villages.
That's an odd way to settle a dispute between Koro.
Maybe.
Macku shrugged.
But it worked! And the Pomatoran have been playing it ever since. It's so ingrained into their culture that many forget that the Onomatoran were even involved in its conception.
It's really impressive that you know so much about other villages,
Takua said.
I wish it was more common. I know I've said it before, but we would be a lot better off if we all stuck together. Everyone else only pretends to agree until it comes time to act on it.
Huh, you don't have to worry about that for me.
Takua said proudly.
Everything you've taught me makes me wish I'd left Takoro sooner.
Takoro is great too.
Said Macku.
If you say so.
Takua said dismissively.
I don't know if I could ever go back there.
Why not?
There's nothing there for me anymore. They don't want me there either.
I'm sure that's not true. There's hundreds of wonderful Matoran in Takoro.
There are.
Takua said.
I'm not one of them. I don't resent anyone. It's just the way things are. If I even have a purpose, all I know is that it won't be found there.
Macku frowned.
You're too hard on yourself, Takua. We all have a purpose. Some are just easier to discover than others. Just because they have written you off doesn't mean that you should too.
I hope you're right.
I know I'm right.
Macku replied.
Our paths crossed for a reason. Losing my position in Ga-Koro opened a new opportunity. The island is more divided than ever, and that needs to change if we're ever going to stop Makuta. Now is the time to unite the villages. And since you're here, I won't have to do it alone.
You plan to unite all 6 villages?
Takua asked.
Yes. And now I have you to help me.
And how do you plan on doing that?
I haven't made it that far.
Macku admitted before perking back up.
But I know it's possible. It has to be. The Toa arrive, I meet you, I get freed up from my previously binding responsibilities. There are just too many things happening at once for this to be a coincidence.
I've got nothing better to do,
Takua said with a shrug.
Count me in.
And once we've pulled this off, they'll be begging you to come back to Ga-Koro.
Takua smiled. Though he had little desire to return to his home village, he knew he would be more open to the idea if the Matoran actually wanted him back. Macku's optimistic attitude was infectious, and was alarmingly motivating. He still was unsure of his true purpose, but he decided he was at least heading in the right direction. As the pair of Matoran continued along the sandy path, the ground became flatter, soon allowing the stately walls of Po-Koro to become visible in the distance. Even from so far away, the impressive structures overlooking the pathway to the village gate could be seen. The outer walls rose higher than any structure within them, giving the appearance of nothing but a giant stone box resting in the center of an open desert when viewed from the flat terrain.
There it is,
Macku said.
Po-Koro.
It's bigger than I expected.
Takua replied, laying eyes on the village of stone for the first time.
A lot of that space is used for farmland near the far end.
What kind of farms?
Livestock mostly, but grains and vegetables are common too. When most Matoran think of Po-Matoran, they often only think of carpenters and stonemasons. But they tend to forget Po-Koro also has the largest farming community on the island. The plants are surprisingly fond of the heat.
That's a good point. A lot of our provisions came from here. The Matoran are too focused on farming lava and training warriors to grow much of our own food.
Macku began to further explain the specifics of Po-Matoran agriculture and how their exports contributed to the island's overall economy. This led to the similar topic of the abundance of large game hunters in Ga-Koro and how they also played a role in their own trade. Takua found himself strangely interested by all he was learning. For someone with no discernible skills, he always enjoyed learning new things. Part of the intrigue came from how animated Macku was when explaining these things. She clearly enjoyed sharing her knowledge, which made what some would consider to be such dull topics far more compelling. Takua was a good listener, though most were unaware of that. Few Matoran in Ga-Koro were willing to speak with him long enough to know he genuinely cared to hear what others had to say. Before Macku could continue, a sudden tremor ripped through the ground, shifting the sand beneath their feet. The Matoran forced their balance to steady before it passed, nearly as quickly as it started.
What was that?
Takua asked.
Shh! Don't move.
Macku whispered.
Don't make a sound.
Takua hadn't seen Macku appear so afraid since meeting her, which was not a comforting sight. He complied, keeping as still as he could while saying nothing. Even long after the ground had settled, the two Matoran remained unmoving. Takua wanted to ask what had caused the quake, but kept quiet as he waited for Macku to assure it was safe. He glanced over to see a Motara fiku spider skittering along the ground toward them, seemingly startled by the abrupt tremor. It was smaller than the ones found in Tawahi, but much thicker. Its body was brown with yellow stripes along its 6 legs, while its abdomen resembled a small boulder which was used to conceal itself from predators. The Matoran's eyes locked on the small creature as it passed between their feet, lightly chirping as it ran. It had reached hardly more than 10 feet ahead of them when it was snatched up by a clawed hand sprouting from the sand. The spider thrashed its legs as it was crushed between the claws of a large beast that pushed itself out of the ground. The unmistakable form of a sand Tarakava emerged, shaking the sand from its back before tossing the crushed fiku into its mouth. Sand Tarakava were little more than half the size of the common Tarakava found around Gawahi, but were much faster on land. Its tail was barbed at the end, and its bright yellow armor was rough and jagged. It crunched down, breaking through the mechanical components of the fiku before turning its green eyes toward the Matoran.
Run!
Macku shouted. Takua didn't hesitate. Both Matoran broke into a sprint toward the direction of Po-Koro. The Sand Tarakava paused, deciding which target to pursue first. The red one appeared to be the slower of the two, making him the Rahi's first choice. Despite his rest in Ga-Koro, Takua's injuries had yet to fully heal, which had only become noticeable as he ran for his life. He ignored the pain as well as he could, though his mobility was severely limited. The Tarakava slithered through the sand, clawing forward with its gangly arms as it quickly closed the distance from its prey. Takua pressed on, forcing his legs to move as fast as he could push them. Po-Koro was still a great distance away, and the Rahi was getting closer every second. The open desert offered little protection, giving him no choice but to keep running. The Tarakava swiped its claws, missing Takua's back by mere inches. The closeness of the strike caused Takua to stumble. He lost control of his feet and collapsed onto the ground. Before he could get back to his feet, the Rahi was already on top of him. Macku turned back, halting her run once she saw the Rahi reach Takua. She slipped her supply bag from her shoulders and tossed it to the ground. She reached into a small patch to retrieve a wooden slingshot stored alongside a small sack of protodermis bearings. Takua felt the smothering heat of the creature's breath on his body as he desperately tried to prevent the Tarakava's jaws from snapping down on his throat as Macku took aim. She released the band, firing a shot directly into the Rahi's right eye. The Rahi shrieked, releasing its hold on Takua as it threw its claw over its eye. Takua clambered up from the sand, creating as much distance as he could from the Tarakava. Both Matorans slowly inched backward as it re-evaluated its decision on which one to attack first.
Now what?
Takua asked. Macku glanced back toward the village. It was still more than a mile away, but she could faintly make out a few brown shapes moving along the walls.
Keep running, and make as much noise as you can!
Takua resumed his sprint toward the village, giving the Tarakava the chance to decide to focus on Macku. She fired a second shot before taking off behind Takua. The haste of her escape made it difficult to know if she had missed her target completely, or if the second shot was simply less effective than the first. Either way, the Tarakava wasted no time in its chase. Takua had never ran so fast in his life. Every aching muscle in his body flooded his mind with signals to stop, but he couldn't afford to comply. Macku was slowly catching up to him, but so was the Rahi. As the village drew closer, he threw his arms into the air, calling out toward the guards stationed outside the gate. He received no sign of an answer, but continued to shout.
Over here!
The Tarakava was getting closer, and neither he nor Macku had any chance of reaching the village in time. He called out again. This time he noticed the guard reacting. He called a third time, finally getting their full attention. One of the guards posted along the top of the village wall raised a spyglass up to his eye, investigating the commotion before the small group of Po-Koro guards sprang into action at the sight of the Sand Tarakava chasing the two helpless Matoran toward the village.
They see us! Keep running!
Takua could hardly take any more. He could feel his speed waning as the Sand Tarakava had nearly reached him. He looked down at his feet, hoping to bring them to move faster. Just as the Rahi was close enough to strike, its ear holes were blasted with the distracting call of a distant Po-Koro war horn. Takua looked up from the ground as he continued his run, finding 5 heavily armed Po-Matoran charging toward him on the backs of flightless birds fitted with saddles. Each Matoran wielded a spear, tomahawk, or a bow. 2 of them even carried all 3. The Tarakava reached out to swipe at Takua, until one of the fast-acting guards fired an arrow into its hand. The Tarakava recoiled, halting its chase. Unable to continue his run, Takua collapsed onto the ground as the group of guards stampeded around him, engaging in battle with the Rahi once they had acquired its full attention. Macku slid to her knees just ahead of Takua, quickly ensuring he was unharmed. They sat breathless in the sand as they watched the ensuing fight. One of the guards flung his tomahawk toward the Tarakava's face, only for it to swat it from the air before swiping the Matoran's mouth from under him. The Matoran tumbled onto the ground, quickly recovering as he readied his spear to block another swipe of the Rahi's claws. A second Matoran rode up from behind, firing an arrow into the Tarakawa's tail. It turned to face him, snapping its jaws as it lunged forward. The Matoran reared his bird to avoid the attack as he fired another arrow, which bounced off the mechanical shell of the Tarakawa's face. The third Matoran thrust his spear into the Rahi's flank, distracting it from the second Matoran.
"Keep your distance!"
called the fourth as he circled around to look for an opening. The Tarakawa whipped its barbed tail toward the third Matoran. The Matoran guard cried out as the barbs anchored into the bend of his leg before ripping him off his bird. He crashed onto the ground, gripping his leg. The fourth Matoran fired an arrow into its neck, distracting it long enough for the fifth Matoran to throw his tomahawk, embedding it deep between the plates of its back. The Tarakawa bucked and hissed, swatting aimlessly at any Matoran that came close enough. The second and fourth Matoran fired 2 more arrows into its sides. Unable to pick between the two, it chose to focus on the first Matoran it had knocked to the ground. As it lunged forward, the Po-Matoran held his spear forward. He was knocked off his feet as the spear was driven deep into the Tarakawa's shoulder. The Rahi rolled to its side, hissing and roaring as it pulled the spear from its body. This maneuver exposed its underbelly, making the perfect target for 2 more arrows, only one of which landed between its mechanical plates. As it worked to turn itself upright, the fifth Matoran picked up the spear from the ground, ducking under a wild swipe before burying it into the Tarakawa's eye. The Rahi roared, weakly stumbling along the ground. It gave one final glance toward Takua before slumping onto the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust and sand as the green of its eyes evaporated into the air. Takua was still too shaken to stand. Despite their numbers and strength of arms, the Matoran still had difficulty bringing the Rahi down. Sand Tarakawa were considered to be much weaker than the common species of Ga-Wahi, yet still required significant effort to combat. Still, the experience and cooperation of the Po-Koro Guard prevailed in the end. The Po-Koro Guard employed nearly 200 Po-Matoran, making them the second largest military group on Motunui. Though they were not as expansive as the Ta-Koro Guard, they had established a presence beyond just their village, with a number of small outposts spread across all of Powahi. 2 of the guards dismounted their birds and rushed over to assist their wounded comrade. One of them worked to retrieve the weapons lodged into the Tarakawa's carcass, while the 5th guard approached Takua and Macku.
"Are you all right?"
he asked. Like all Po-Matoran, he was hardy and thick-limbed compared to other races. His noble Kanohi Miru was a reddish-brown, matching the rest of his body that was accented by a dark shade of tan. He was fitted with an external set of armor in the form of a steel chestplate and bladed pauldrons over his shoulders. By the looks of his armor, he appeared to be their leader.
"Yeah,"
Takua panted.
"we're fine. Thanks for saving us."
"You picked a bad time to visit Po-Koro, Macku,"
said the guard. Based on her status as former right hand paired with her many unauthorized trips to the village of Stone, Takua was unsurprised that the guard knew Macku by name.
It's all right, Zathlo,
Macku replied.
San Tarakawa are nothing new. Still, we owe you one.
"I'm not talking about the Rahi, Macku. There's been an outbreak. It's hit nearly half the village."
"What?
Takua asked in surprise.
What kind of outbreak?"
Zathlo shrugged.
"We don't know. Some kind of sickness. We've never seen anything like it."
You said half the village has been affected.
Macku said.
When did it start?
3 days ago. No doubt the work of Makuta. One day the Toa arrive and everyone is in high spirits, and the next, almost 800 Po-Matoran are quarantined in their beds, dehydrated and unable to move while they get angry at hallucinations.
Macku paused, processing the news as she tried to form her next thoughts.
What about Huki? I need to see him.
I would strongly advise against that, Macku,
said Zathlo.
Now, I can't in good conscience ask you to turn back after what you've already been through today. But it's bad in there. We don't even know how it's spreading.
Take me to see him,
Macku said sternly. Zathlo glanced back at his wounded guard and the dead Tarakaba before nodding hesitantly.
Okay,
He mumbled.
if you're certain.
He turned to address the other guards.
Piatra, escort these two back to the village. Take my Dekapi and get them saddled up. The rest of us will hang back with Allie.
Yes, Sergeant,
replied one of the guards, already leading two of the Rahi mounts toward Takua and Macku. The Dekapi were flightless, featherless birds native to Powahi that stood only slightly taller than the average Matoran. Their stubby wings appeared to serve no practical purpose. Their natural speed and seemingly endless endurance had made them a useful asset to the Po-Koro Guard for decades, serving as messengers, scouts, and transportation across the open desert. Their beaks were rounded and dull, requiring them to resort to hard, blunt force when using them for defense. Some Po-Koro guards were known to fit their Dekapi with spiked muzzles over their beaks to make them even more effective. The guard assisted Takua and Macku onto the saddles before taking the reins in each hand and walking toward the distant village.
Drop them off at the gate,
Zathlo ordered before they departed.
Ensure they understand they're entering at their own peril.
The 20-minute ride to the village walls was unsettling. Their escort hardly said a word, much like Kai when they departed Ga-Koro. Takua knew entering the village during the outbreak was a bad idea, but he had no intention of even attempting to talk Macku out of it. Most of his fear and uncertainty was on her behalf. She had much more to live for, and therefore much more to lose if she got infected. But he knew she would never rest until she ensured Huki was safe. He tried to think optimistically. Sure, it was dangerous, but perhaps the virus only infected Po-Matoran and he could take advantage of his natural immunity to aid the sick. Either way, he would do whatever he could to help. Macku's constant preaching about the villages coming together had begun to rub off on him. They soon arrived at the long, stretching path leading up to the village gate. On either side of the path were 12 giant stone carvings of Matoran heads looking inward toward those approaching the village. Each statue was depicted wearing one of the 12 types of kanohi worn by all Matoran. The statues on the left side of the path wore the great versions of the 12 kanohi types, which stood parallel to the noble versions worn by the ones on the right. All 24 masks displayed their own unique design and style, all while remaining recognizable to all Matoran on the island. At the road's end was the village gate, carved out of the mouth of a maskless Matoran face. Po-Matoran were known to be some of the most artistic of all Matoran, and a single glance at their magnificent village entrance was all it took to prove that.
this is as far as I'm taking you, travelers.
The guard said.
I'll signal them to open the gate for you. Good luck.